you came last time and you've come back again, or if you didn't come last time, maybe you heard about this and decided to try it this time. We're so glad that you are all here today. This is our second Tell Me a Story event. There was a library event recently with the reading of stories, but this is Tell Me a Story, and so this is our second time around. You have received cards, and we hope that you'll make any comments for us today. This has been most helpful to us from last time. If you have a story that comes to your mind that you want to tell, or tell us that you want to do that. Or if you've heard somebody else tell a really good story at the dinner table or somewhere else, write that down too. It's not spying on them to do that, by the way. Or if you have any suggestions, just let us know on your card what we can do to make this work. We have 5 storytellers again today. Some are funny, some will give you a little tear in your eye. But we have, again, as we did last time, had a rehearsal. We've practiced through these, and I can guarantee you they're all great stories. So we're going to go ahead and get started with our first storyteller today. And that is Barbara Kessel, who lives in East Apartments, in apartment 337. She moved here in August of 2005 with her husband, Ray, and he passed away in 2007. And Barbara's going to tell us a story you just will not believe. It's true, though. Come on, Barbara.
It is true. Now, I'm not good about this.
Lean in.
Like that?
Yeah.
There you go. Now, hold on. Okay, you're not going to believe what happened this morning.
Oh.
Now, that's too close. I was rooting around in a drawer looking for something, and I bumped into this piece of paper, and I pulled it out, and it's a bookmark. You know how they send you bookmarks, people. They want money. Send your bookmarks. Okay, listen to this. You're not going to believe it. Because I was not a little... Anyway, listen. The future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams. Eleanor Roosevelt. That's what I found this morning about 10 o'clock. Can you believe it?
Can you all hear?
Am I in the right
Can
place?
everybody hear? If you cannot hear, raise your hand. Can you hear? She's good. Okay. Barbara, I want to pull that microphone out just a little bit.
Yeah, there shouldn't be any back.
Yeah, but I want to make sure everybody's hearing you. Just pull it out. And
Oh.
don't be afraid of it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm afraid. Okay. I was 9 years old, and I had a good friend, and her name was Anne. And now nobody much wanted to play with Anne, but me. But I loved to play with Anne. They lived in a great big house on top of a great big mountain. And they had gorgeous trees, big old virgin oaks. And they had big old rocks, and I used to climb on those big rocks. Anyway, I loved to play with Anne. Well, she asked me to come over and for a very special thing next week and meet Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, I was 9 years old. So I went home. I said, sure. I went home and I said to my parents, now you have to know this. My mother was a Democrat and my father was a Republican. So I asked if I could go, and they both said yes. So I got all ready. I didn't know about that difference. Got all ready to go, and I had on my little smock dress. Remember those? And little black Mary Janes, and I was all gussied up. And my mother said, now, you know, Barbara Ann, my middle name, that you must curtsy. And she had taught me always to curtsy when I met older people. That's old-fashioned European, but that's what we did. Now, you know, if you don't know what a curtsy is, I'm going to show you.
It's
It's like this. You don't bow your head. Okay, you can do that. You go like this. Can't do that now. My knees. Anyway, and my father said, now Barbara, I want you to learn this. I want you to be able to say this to Mrs. Roosevelt. Only in a country like this, like ours, could a little girl like me get to meet the President of the United States, the wife of the President of the United States. He wasn't there. So I learned that, the wife of the President of the United States, and I was beginning to understand. So I went to the party, and all my friends were hiding in the bushes over there looking, because they knew too. And I met her out under these trees, all these fancy men with their dark suits, and I found out later on that Ann's father had run for Democratic governor of West Virginia, so they were in politics, but I didn't know that at the time. Anyway, I met Mrs. Roosevelt, and I did my little curtsy, and I said my little song, verse, and I remember she patted me on the head, and I looked up, and I saw her mouth and her lots of teeth. And that was about all that I saw. But she said to me, oh, how nice, thank you very much. And then she called me by name, Barbara. Well, I was floating around on air. And about that time, my friend Ann said, come on, we're going upstairs. So we did say, excuse us, to her mama. And then we went upstairs, and we went up the beautiful big staircase. And and we walked by Eleanor Roosevelt's room, and we looked in, and on the beds were these huge hats. And she did have one on downstairs. And you remember everybody wore those big hats. We went in and tried on those hats and looked in the mirror and pranced around like we were something else. And then, this gets worse, we opened the door to their closet, and there were her shoes. They were big, I mean big. And we put our dear little feet, did take her shoes off, into those shoes and walked around and tried on everything and looked in the mirror and thought we were just the cat's ankles. And then we heard somebody coming up the stairs, and we were terrified. But there wasn't time to do anything, to put anything away, so we just froze. And they went on up to the 3rd floor. We were so thankful. And then we very quickly and very carefully put the hats back just as we found them, and the shoes back just as we found them, and ran to Ann's room and pretended like we had been there all afternoon.
Barbara doesn't know that I have this, but I have a picture of her about that age. So if you want to see it up close afterwards, I'll put it over on the piano. But it's a sweet little picture.
Those pigtails were down.
Oh my goodness, pigtails down to her waist, or to her seat. Our next storyteller today is Penn Watson. Penn was here last time, and he filled out his little card, and he said, I have a story to tell, and I want to tell it next time. Penn lives in Villa 23 and has been here since September of 2007. Moved here with his dear wife, Jiva, who died last year in the summertime. So Penn, come on up. Yeah, come on this side.
My name is Penn Watson. Move over. Thank you for getting started. I already messed up. Can you hear me now? Yes. My name is Penn Watson. And that's P-E-N-N, Penn. Penn Watson. And I live in Springmore. I told you, Village 23.
Penn, you're not talking loud enough.
Thank you. I live in Springmore, Village 23. Can you hear me in the back row now?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll talk a little louder. The reason I'm here is to tell you this true story. Now, this is a story about my wife and I going to England to meet her kinfolks. Now, Jeeva's mother was from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and her father was an admiral in the Royal Navy. She was brought up in England and Scotland. And I'd met most of her parents that lived in America. Most of them lived in Southern Pines. I mean, not her parents, I mean all her kinfolk. But I had never met most of her aunts, her uncles, and all the ones that lived in England. So after we'd been married 2 or 3 years, we decided, and I decided, that we really ought to go to England and actually meet all their cousins, aunts, and uncles, and all that sort of thing, in the Dundas part of the family. So we did, and we went in the summertime, and we stayed with one of her aunts, and one of the older aunts decided to give us a tea. Now, when you give a tea in England, it's not like cooking out in the backyard and having hamburgers and that kind of thing. This was the real thing. I mean, it was very formal. Everybody was all dressed up, and we actually had tea and crumpets and that sort of thing. And I didn't know anybody there but Jimmy. We just arrived. So I said, well, I'll go out and introduce myself. So I went up to these different people. I walked to this lady. I said, how do you do, ma'am? I said, my name is Penn Watson. That's P-E-N-N. And I live in Raleigh, North Carolina, in the United States. And the reason I'm here is I wanted to meet Jeeva's cousins and that sort of thing. And I'm Jeeva's husband. Now, Jeeva is what all her family called her. Her name was Jeeva Ruth Dundas Watson. That's a mouthful, isn't it? But most of her friends here, and quite a few of y'all knew Jeeva, and most all of you call her Jeeva Watson. So to make a long story short, I decided that I would, by the way, she was very active in Encore, if any of y'all are familiar with Encore, and she was also very active in Elder Hostel and told stories about some of the famous people, mainly presidents and past presidents. And her favorite of all was the Prime Minister of England. What is his name?
Winston Churchill.
Winston Churchill. That was her favorite. She told that quite a bit. And so anyway, I walked up to all these people and I said, the reason I'm here is I'm Jeeva's husband. And they say, oh, they say, glad to see you. Welcome to England. Good show, good show. I said, man, I was pretty impressed. And I went up to this man and I walked up to him and I said, how do you do, sir? I said, my name is Penn Watson. That's P-E-N-N, Penn. And I live in Raleigh, North Carolina, in the United States. And the reason I'm here is I'm Jeeva's husband. Now this man was very, very distinguished looking. He was tall, and he was dressed in the best, nicest looking country gentleman's outfit you ever saw. And he'd been there standing over there in the corner watching, seeing what was going on. And he says, my name is Rupert Ponsonby. R-U-P-E-R-T, Rupert. And the reason I'm here, this is my house.
Our third storyteller is Audrey DeMai. Audrey moved here in 2008, thank you. And she and her husband Nick lived here. Her husband Nick died in November of last year. I met Audrey when I was here doing an internship, and then early in my full-time here, we spent some time together, and she told me the story that I'm going to read for her. It is her story. I am providing the voice today because Audrey has a condition of her voice that makes it difficult for her to speak so that you could understand her in a large group like this. And but I want you to be clear, this is Audrey's story. I'll be reading it in the first person as she dictated it to me. The story is called The Nickel. And this is Audrey. When she sits down, you can't see her. So. Okay, you want to just sit while I read? Yeah, go ahead. It was Depression times, 1933 to be exact. I was 13 years old and lived with my parents and older sister Opal in Rocky Mount, North Carolina. Daddy worked at night for the Atlantic Coastline Railroad as a hostler, moving locomotives from one track to another in the train yard. Mama did all those important things to keep our family well cared for. We weren't poor, but we didn't have money to spend on luxuries. That's what made the nickel so important to me. That and the fact that it was one of the ways my daddy showed his love for me. You see, he had a clip change purse, and when he'd come in from work in the mornings, he'd always put it on the mantle. Each morning I was allowed to take a nickel to spend at the drugstore on my way home from school. Since Daddy worked at night and slept during the day while Opal and I were at school, he was often awake in the afternoons when we got home. He would take me downtown with him sometimes in the afternoons, take me along as he visited with the people that we would see there. Daddy would stand at the corner and talk with one person after another. I was never bored listening to the grown-ups talk. I knew if I waited long enough, we would visit the standard drugstore where he would get me a Coke. Back then, everything good cost a nickel. Ice cream, a candy bar, a Coke. When we get back home, Mama would always ask me, "Who did you see downtown today?" I'd tell her we saw some of the businessmen in town. Daddy was a city alderman, and it was important for him to know what was going on in Rocky Mount. One early spring day, my friend Dot and I were working on our homework on the daybed in the sitting room. Daddy had been out with his brothers taking care of some property that they all owned in a busy part of Rocky Mount. When he came back, he realized he had gotten chilled and needed to warm up. Since the only room with heat in our house was the sitting room, he asked Dot and I if we would move into the kitchen so that he could lie down on the daybed. Soon after that, Mama called the doctor, who examined Daddy and told him to rest over the weekend. Daddy had a large family who came to see him on Sunday.
He was tired after that. On Monday, I went to school as usual, and as usual, I came home for lunch. My sister was at home since she had graduated at that February from high school. I remember that when I came home that day for lunch, Opal was ironing. I asked her where Mama and Daddy were, and she told me that Dr. Spate had come in to examine Daddy and told him that he needed to go to the hospital. The Atlantic Coastline Railroad Hospital was less than a block from our home. Since Daddy didn't think he was very sick, he told the doctor he would just walk there. He just could not accept paying the $5 it would cost to have the ambulance come for him. But Dr. Spate didn't agree, so they called the ambulance and Daddy was taken to the hospital. I ate my lunch and returned to school. When I came home that afternoon, Opal and I went to see Daddy at the hospital. He seemed to be feeling pretty well. We stayed for a while and then returned home. Mama came home, cooked our supper, and then went back to the hospital. Daddy told Mama when she came back that he had been sleeping and had a dream that he was flying. He told her he loved her. It was after that that he got really sick. One of the nurses, Bessie Bailey, called Opal and me about 8:30 that night and asked us to come to the hospital. When we got to his room, 2 doctors were working over him. We weren't allowed to enter the room, but we could see them through the doorway. We found out that he had had 2 heart attacks. The high blood pressure he had was affecting his heart. My daddy, Richard Elwood Boone, died later that night. This was such a shock for me, my sister, my mother, all of our family. What would we do without him? How could Daddy be gone? I didn't think he was that sick. The funeral was to be on Wednesday. Mama went to select Daddy's casket. The funeral home was connected with Mr. Gay's hardware store. There was an elevator in the hardware store, and when you took it up to the 2nd floor, you could see the caskets. Mr. Gay told Mama that he thought so much of Daddy that she should select whatever casket that she wanted, and if she didn't have enough money, he would take care of it. Back then, they took the body back home for the funeral. I remember that his body was in our living room and that there were so many fresh flowers that people had sent. About 3 weeks after his funeral, I began to feel really sad. One day I went into the kitchen where Mama was and I really started crying. She asked me what was wrong. I told her I hadn't had any money to go to the drugstore. She picked me up and set me on the long wooden kitchen table. She put her arms around me and she cried and I cried. We were both in pain over this huge loss in our lives. We were drawn together by our deep sadness. She was so sorry she hadn't given me the money to go to the drugstore. Honey, I've had so many things on my mind lately. I didn't realize you weren't getting that nickel. Audrey, she said, we don't have much, but we do have enough so that you can always have a nickel to go to the drugstore. To help ease my pain, she gave me a quarter. I can remember thinking, she gave me a quarter. That is so much money. She told me to go to the drugstore and get whatever I wanted. That money couldn't bring my daddy back. He was gone and I missed him so much. It had been such a shock. He was careful with money, but we always had what we needed. Being able to cry with Mama and her being able to cry with me and tell her about my sadness is something I've always remembered. Having her give me the money that day helped me have a little bit of normalcy at a time when my life was anything but normal.
Thank you, Audrey. Thank you, Dad. Great. Doesn't life have some moments? Some funny ones, some sad ones. That's life, isn't it? Bob Spencer is going to come next. Bob lives in West Apartments, apartment 166, and has been here since December of '08. He moved here with his wife, Liv, who died last year in February. And Bob has a very moving story he's going to share with us right now. And I think you'll catch a little bit of a theme between two of our stories today. Bob.
Well, let's go back to the very beginning. I was born in March of 1930. 17 months later, October 1931, I had polio. We were living just in Guilford County, just outside Greensboro, over near McLeansville. And it took the doctors 3 weeks to determine what I had. First day, my left arm wouldn't work. It was paralyzed. 3 days later, I couldn't walk. My right leg was paralyzed. And nobody was thinking polio. Because in 1931, the only person to have polio in Guilford County was me. March of 1933, I celebrated my 3rd birthday, and Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated for his first term as President of the United States. At age 3, I didn't know what a president was. But 3 years later, when I turned 6 and was preparing to enter school, I did know what a president was, and I knew that the president had had polio, just like me. And my preschool mind reasoned that if he could have polio and become the president, then surely I could do something with my life if I just worked hard enough. And I entered school with that in mind. Halfway through the elementary grades, I learned what a valedictorian was, and I determined that I wanted to be the valedictorian of my class when I graduated. I was 14 when I entered high school. And after a few weeks of high school, I realized that all of those boys that had played with me through the elementary grades and had been my friends were now playing football, basketball, baseball, and other those things. All those things I couldn't do. And I began to feel all alone again. I knew that the president was going to Warm Springs, Georgia quite often because that warm water felt good to his polio limbs. And I knew too that warm water felt good to my polio limbs. So one day, without telling my parents, I sat down and wrote a letter to the president. And I asked him if he could recommend some place that I could go and get some help with my polio problems. Now, of course, remember, this was fall of 1944. World War II was still going on in Europe and in Asia. The president was a very busy man, and I would not have been surprised if I had never heard from anything from that letter. But 2 weeks later, I was very surprised when I went to the post office and opened box 217, pulled out the mail, and the letter on the very top was from the White House. I rushed home with it, showed it to my mother, and explained to her about my writing a letter to the president. And then we quickly opened it to see what the president had written to me. We began to read the letter, and it said, "Dear Bobby, my husband has asked me to respond to your letter." So it was not from the president, it was from his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. And she went on to say that she had been in telephone contact with an orthopedic surgeon in Asheboro, North Carolina, who specialized in working with polio victims. And she had made an appointment with him for me to go and see him. He would examine me, evaluate my case, and make recommendations on where we should go from there. Well, obviously, we kept that appointment. And after he had examined me, he said he would recommend that I go to the North Carolina Orthopedic Hospital in Gastonia, because they were far better equipped to take care of cases like mine and do the things that he realized I needed to have done for me than he could do there in Asheboro. But he says it may take several months for you to get in, because they have a real backlog of people wanting to have services done at that hospital. And it did take 5 months. I was admitted in March 1945, just a few days before my 15th birthday. I soon had the first of 3 surgeries that I would have in that hospital. And in April of 1945, while I was still recuperating from that first surgery, we learned that President Roosevelt had died in Warm Springs, Georgia. We shortly learned, too, that his body would be returned to Washington, D.C. by train, and that train would come through Gastonia. And I wanted so much to go see that train. I wanted so much to see the car that his casket would be riding in. But I knew that was not possible. I couldn't go. I was flat on my back in the bed with a body cast from my neck to my hips. My left arm was in a cast that, of course, was fastened to the body cast at the shoulder, but there was a brace between that cast on my arms and the body cast down about the hips. There was no way I could put on clothes. And besides, they had taken bone from my left leg, the shin bone of my left leg, to do bone grafts in my arm. And I couldn't put any weight on that leg until that bone had completely healed. There was no way I could go see that train and be a part of that throng of people down there watching it pass through. We couldn't see the trains from the hospital as they went through town, but we could hear them. The tracks were close enough that we could hear every train. And the night the President's train came through, I lay there in bed listening to the train, wishing that I could be a part of that thousands of people who were along the tracks watching it. But if I listened to the train, I could hear the sound of that steam engine that was chug, 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 chug. That told me that the engineer had slowed that train to a very slow pace, just about the speed a person would walk, in order to give the thousands of people who were watching that train pass through a good opportunity to see the President's car. Thousands saw it, but I was not one of them. When World War II ended, at a conference in San Francisco, they created the United Nations. And Eleanor Roosevelt was soon named the United States ambassador to the United Nations. After 2 more surgeries and 6 months in the orthopedic hospital, I was released in September of 1945 and returned to my high school. School had been going about 3 weeks for my sophomore year when I got back there. I graduated in 1948. I didn't quite make my goal of being class valedictorian. I missed it by 1/10 of 1 point. But the second place was good enough to get me a full rehab scholarship to Carolina. I entered Carolina, Chapel Hill, in fall of 1948. And while I was in school there, Eleanor Roosevelt came to conduct a 3-day seminar on the United Nations. And this was a seminar for the faculty. She came to help them to understand why the UN was formed, what it was trying to do, how it operated, and all that sort of thing, so they could pass it on to their students. But every night of for those three nights, she spoke in Memorial Auditorium, and the general public was invited in to hear those speeches, and I went all 3 nights to hear her. I had an opportunity to speak to her and to thank her for what she had done for me in 1944, and also to thank her for everything she had done since then. I told her about all the things that had happened in my life, and she was so glad to learn that I had been able to take advantage of the things that she had arranged for me through the doctor that sent me to the hospital in Gastonia. I didn't get to see the president the way I had wanted to, but to see his wife and to hear her tell me that she was glad to see me was quite enough for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. And our last storyteller of the day is D.G. Harwood. D.G. lives with his wife Ruth in South Village. They've been here since June of 2009. D.G.?
The time of this story is 1953. The location for the story is Cleveland County, North Carolina. County seat is Shelby, the city of politicians and shade trees. You may remember the Gardners, the Hueys, the Moes that have virtually ran politics in this state for a decade or two. I was a newly appointed assistant county agent with the North Carolina Agricultural Extension Service, as it was called at that time. My mission was to work with the livestock producers in Cleveland County. After I'd been there a few months, one morning while I was doing some paperwork, I got a phone call from a Mr. Elliott, who was a livestock producer up in the northwest part of the county, and he told me he wanted me to come up and dehorn a little bull that he had. And after some hesitation, I told him I would. I said, "How big is that bull?" Because I knew in some cases they like to tie the bull to a tree out in the yard, and I needed to know how big that bull was. Well, he told me it's just a little bull. So I told him I would be there about 1 o'clock. And after I thought about that, I had sort of a dilemma for 2 or 3 reasons. I guess you're wondering why we even dehorn the cows to start with. Well, in the first place, animals like that are sort of mean to each other occasionally, and with those horns they can do bad damage to an animal, even in some cases up to death. But in a lot of cases, they wound each other. Well, that's one reason. The other reason is that when you're handling these animals, particularly bulls, sometimes that can be fairly dangerous, particularly if he's got horns. So the farmers like to have those horns off. Now, another part of my dilemma was that the policy of the North Carolina Agricultural Extension Service, an educational agency, was that dehorning cattle and vaccinating cattle was service work. And the policy was that there was nothing educational about that, so extension agents shouldn't do that. It should be left to the service of the veterinarians in the area who were well equipped to do it. But of course that system kind of breaks down when you have, say, a call from a county commissioner who wants his cow dehorned, and he's being a part of the federal, state, and local government complex that hires and fires you, you tend to feel a little favor on his request. Well, in this case, I went out to Mr. Elliott's farm that afternoon, and I had some apprehension as I got near his place because there were a lot of old beat-up pickup trucks and some fairly old cars circled around the barn. And I didn't quite understand what was going on unless this Mr. Elliott had the neighborhood bull, and they were all interested in how this bull got along. I determined later that that's not what they came for. As I got to the barn, it was a traditional barn for that area. Had an alley down the middle about big enough to drive a wagon through, stables on each side, 2x4 studs making a wall with boards about 6 inches apart to hold it up. The bull was in one of those stables on the side of the barn, and Mr. Elliott had simply cut a hole with 2 boards out to pull the bull's head through so that we could operate on him from the entryway while he was still standing in the stable. Well, I was a little bit concerned about that, even though Mr. Elliott had a ring in the bull's nose, which is often used with bulls so that you can handle them, and he had a rope to that ring, and he had tied that around a post nearby. I told Mr. Elliott, I just don't believe that bull is going to be secure in that arrangement. Oh, he says, what's the matter with you, boy? That bull's going to be there forever. Now go ahead and cut his horns off. Well, I decided what must be, so I took my dehorners. If you're not familiar with dehorners, they look somewhat like pruning shears that you'd use in your yard, except they've got handles about 4 feet long, and they weigh about 4 or 5 times as much. So they're very heavy equipment. About this time, these neighboring farmers who had been there coming in their trucks and cars gathered up fairly close to see what was going on. I later determined that what they were there for, they just thought that bull would get the best of me, and they wanted to laugh about that new assistant agent going back to town defeated. They were not extension clientele typically. They had torn overalls and taken their Sunday suit coats and worn them for every day, and they were greasy and misshapen along with the greasy and misshapen hats. And they were the type that if you said hello to them, they kind of squinted at you for an hour or two and then let loose with a big stream of tobacco juice. They were salt of the earth type people, and I was glad we were there. Well, when in this instance, normally I would have tied a string around the bull's horns, which would have, in effect, reduced the chance of any bleeding that might have occurred. But that bull being about 6 inches from me and already looking antagonistically at me, I just didn't feel comfortable doing that, so we decided to forego that. I put the pruners on his horn on one side, and you have to be pretty careful because if you get it too close, you're going to get part of the skin. If you get it too far apart, later the horn will grow a nub back there, and the farmer will be unhappy with that, so you have to be pretty careful. But once I got it located correctly, then it was all I could do to get the horn cut off. And when I cut that horn off, that bull went crazy. He jumped up and bellowed, and he came through that wall like it wasn't even there. Oh, of course, all these neighboring farmers, they ran out the end of the barn, but I just jumped up on a sill on the opposite side of the alleyway because I noticed in those 2 or 3 seconds that that bull, while he came through the wall, he still was tied to the post with the bull ring and the rope, so he just whirled the rear around right where I'd been standing about a second before. But anyway, Mr. Elliott's helper put some boards back up and nailed them up more securely, and they got the bull back in, and then we got the dehorners on the other horn and cut that one off too with no incidents. But as I was packing up my equipment, and after having applied some sulfur to the wound, I was getting ready to pack up, go back to the office. I overheard one of those neighboring farmers say to the other as he left, "Did you see that county agent run when that bull came through that wall?"
Let's have our storytellers stand and give them another round of applause. So much for a delightful delightful afternoon, for your careful attention to getting your stories ready for us and for telling them. And I thank all of you for coming and for laughing. And I have some tears, laughter tears and sad tears too. We'll do this again next month. We promise another good time. And fill out your little cards for us, if you will, and we'll pick them up from you. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of the afternoon.